something that's on my mind all the time, and I started thinking about it yesterday. I was, driving in traffic, and I'm out on the freeway, and there's cars all around me, and passing me, and I'm passing them, and I don't know if anyone's ever experienced this, but it was almost like this surreal moment. Like time just starts slowing down as I'm looking around, and I'm starting to think, what is our purpose? Well, what is our purpose for our existence as human beings? Is this the extent of what we are? And what I mean by that is, we're told and made to believe that you got to go to school and get this education that we're telling you is a good education. Where you learn to give the answers right and take the test properly. You graduate. You go on to the next level of education so that you can get that piece of paper and then go get your good job, work in your little cubicle or your office or your factory or, flipping burgers or waiting tables, whatever it is, and be a good, productive member of society. Go in debt, get you a house, have a nice, comfortable place to sit and watch your TV, raise a family, retire, and then be put in a grave. I mean, is that the extent of our existence? Or is there more out there for us? Are we being confined and restricted because of maybe the system that's around us? Because of the lack of total freedom in our lives? Do we have a greater potential that we are missing? And this is a question that I struggle with all the time, and I guess it's kind of that, old question, what's the meaning of life? And I kind of take it another step further. What is the reason for our existence? Is there a greater purpose for us as human beings? And if that answer, I believe, is yes, then what is it that's holding us back? What is it that's keeping us from that next level of existence and experiencing life?
I want you to think about something. Really think about it. What is authority? What is authority? And how does that relate to you? If it is a moral authority, an institute of ethics, morality, and such, where did it derive its power? Opinion. This is set for this, and this is set for that, and we all agree on that. And who basically gave them the moral imperative or the authority to proclaim themselves a moral authority? Themselves. That's the truth. That's truth. Alright, educational authority. Who gave them the authority to proclaim themselves a height of a form of educational institute and such? Themselves. Alright? That's who proclaim themselves as an authority of an educational institute. Alright? Now, churches. Authority of God. We're getting into a very questionable nature at this point in time, right? Who allowed them to speak in the name of our Creator? Themselves. Do you get that? But who gave them the authority of God? Themselves, through writing, to change. Let's just be frankly honest, people. The government has made itself an authority, the same as all others. All these institutes have made themselves an authority, and the only reason why they have power is because you, as an individual, have agreed to it. You see how that works? That's how that works. And that when an authority becomes corrupt and no longer serves the people's opinions, that the only ones that can destroy that authority or change it is who? Those that have proclaim themselves the authority changing themselves, or the people in general. Right? In this world. Do you get that? What authority actually is. Authority is about you surrendering your personal willpower, your personal belief systems to follow into something else.
Imagine you have a friend called George. You've been friends since childhood. Although you're not as close as you were back then, you still see each other once in a while and get along very well. One day, you and George are approached by an old mutual friend, Oliver. Oliver explains that he's had a run of bad luck and is raising money to cover tuition fees for his kids. You want to help Oliver out, so you give him some money. To your surprise, George doesn't offer Oliver any help. You try to persuade him, but it's no use. Imagining yourself in this situation, do you think it's okay to threaten to use physical force against George to get him to do the right thing? Now imagine a slightly different situation. This time, a group of your friends take a vote. 6 out of 10 are in favour of threatening George to get him to help Oliver. Does this democratic process make it okay to threaten George? One last change to the situation. This time, imagine that many thousands of people have democratically agreed that a group, who we'll call the agents, should do whatever is necessary to take money from George and give it to Oliver's family. The agents don't explicitly threaten George at first. All they do is send him a bill. Like everyone else, though, George knows what will happen if he doesn't pay the bill. First, he'll get more letters demanding payment, and the bill will get bigger. Eventually, if he still doesn't pay, agents with guns will break into his house and take him away against his will. Almost everyone pays the bills without protest. They know that agents are prepared to use as much force as necessary to overpower you if you resist. Do you think it's acceptable for the agents to threaten violence against George if he doesn't give his money towards helping Oliver's family? If we approve of state programs that redistribute wealth, we must also approve of threats of violence made against peaceful individuals, because this is how the funds are collected. On the other hand, most of us feel uncomfortable about threatening peaceful people when we imagine having to make the threats ourselves. If we feel negatively towards the idea of threatening George personally, can we really be comfortable with the threats made against him by agents of the state? Some people believe that voluntary interaction and spontaneous order are realistic and preferable alternatives to state coercion as a way of organising society. Do a web search for some of these terms if you're interested in learning more.
Chairman Mao said, "Every communist must grasp the truth. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun." The power of the state is of course political, so Chairman Mao could have said that the power of the state grows out of the barrel of a gun. Is this rhetoric a fair representation of reality? I hope to show why it is. A state is definitionally an entity that holds a monopoly on the right to initiate force in a given territory. The state's primary tool for controlling society is legislation. If there's a perceived problem with the way parts of society are functioning, the response tends to be to add new legislation, ostensibly to fix the problem. In a democracy, competing groups use the ballot box to fight over which items of legislation get enacted. Legislation is toothless unless it's enforced. Enforcement means a gradation of increasingly severe punishments. If the disobedient citizen does not cooperate in receiving his punishment, for instance, if he refuses to pay fines, then physical force will be used against him to impose the punishment. The agents of the state are prepared to use as much force as necessary to overpower the disobedient citizen if he does not cooperate with being punished. It's important in assessing the opening quote in this video to recognize that this escalation of force will not end until the disobedient citizen has received the designated punishment or is dead. And this is worth emphasizing. The agents of the state will kill a citizen before they give up trying to punish him. And this is really important to bear in mind. We know this is the case because we can think about what would happen if it wasn't. If it wasn't the case, the state would quickly collapse. For instance, if the state had a policy to stop trying to extract taxes from citizens who resisted hard enough, for instance by firing warning shots in the air when their would-be kidnappers trespassed on their property, then soon everyone will be firing warning shots and not paying taxes. Since the only resources that a state has are those that it steals from productive people in the form of taxes, if it wasn't prepared to use deadly force to collect taxes, its lifeblood would quickly stop flowing and the state's power would evaporate. In our time, a gun is an appropriate symbol for deadly force, and state power grows out of the barrel of a gun because the effectiveness of state legislation, including tax legislation, depends on the ability and willingness of the agents of the state to kill disobedient citizens.
Hello, my name is Larkin Rose, and like a lot of people these days, I'm fairly strapped for cash, but I think I've come up with a solution. I'm allowed to rob you. Having to earn money is just too inconvenient, so I just gave myself permission to rob you. So I'll be by your house around, let's say, noon tomorrow to see which of your stuff I want to take. Now, this isn't just a threat. I'm not just saying I'm going to rob you. I, by writing this down, gave myself the moral right to rob you. So maybe I should have done it like this. I hereby grant to myself the absolute moral right to steal your stuff. So since I just gave myself the moral right to take your stuff, I'm sure when I show up you'll give me a warm welcome. And in case you think I can't give to myself the right to rob you, some friends of mine helped me out with this one. They signed this one, so it isn't just me now. A lot of people have given me the right to rob you. And in case you weren't impressed with these sort of simple printouts, my friends and I had a very formal meeting and put together this somewhat verbose but very official-looking document. You can read all the details if you really want, but the long and short of it is, now I'm allowed to rob you. So this document makes it all legit. I now have moral permission to rob you, and since I'm sure you're a fine, upstanding citizen, I'm sure you're going to cooperate when I show up tomorrow. So if you could have your valuables all laid out by noon tomorrow so I could see which of your stuff I want to take, that would be good. And then we can... What? Why are you giving me that look? Yeah, surely you don't doubt that this gives me the right to rob you. Surely you're not questioning the legitimacy of this document. Surely you wouldn't still claim that I don't have the right to rob you. I do. See? It says so right there. What, you don't think this is good enough? You don't think that this is binding on you? You don't think that this gives me the right to rob you? Let me show you something. This is a copy of the United States Constitution. And what it says, among other things, is that the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. In other words, a long time ago, a bunch of guys got together and wrote down on a piece of paper, we have the right to rob you. Now, they didn't call it robbery, they called it taxation, because it sounds nicer. But it's essentially the same thing. We have the right to take your property from you by force, if necessary, without your consent. Now, they also wrote a whole lot of rules about how the robbers would be appointed and the legislative rituals which would have to precede the robbery and the different kinds of robbery they'd be allowed to do. But in essence, what this piece of the Constitution says is, we have the right to rob you. And did you believe them? When I did it, when I wrote down on paper that I had the right to rob you, you gave me a funny look. When they did it, did you believe them? Did you accept that this gave them moral permission to take your property without your consent? I bet you did. If you're like 99.999% of the population, you have accepted as unquestionable gospel the notion that this piece of paper gave to some mere mortal human beings the moral right to forcibly confiscate wealth from other people and call it taxation. In fact, if you're like 99.999% of the population, you've never even thought about this until right now. The IRS, it's hundreds of offices across the country, it's 100,000 employees, all the properties they've seized, all the bank accounts they've wiped out, all the people they've prosecuted and thrown in prison, all federal taxes, income, estate, employment, excises, all of them, all federal tax collection stems from this scribble of ink on a piece of parchment. This is supposedly the source of the authority for every bit of that. These few words scrawled on a piece of parchment a couple hundred years ago. By writing this, they claim to bestow upon those people calling themselves Congress a right that you don't have and I don't have. The right to take money by force, if necessary, from other people. And I bet that up till now, you have accepted that as unquestionably legitimate. You accepted the notion that this little bit of ink on a piece of parchment written hundreds of years ago actually gave moral permission for certain people to rob millions of other people. And I bet you look down on any who don't believe it. The people who are called tax cheats because they try to not get robbed, even though this piece of parchment says that somebody is allowed to rob them, I bet you think they're despicable criminals. I bet you cheer when those people have their bank accounts wiped out and their houses seized and get thrown in jail because you really believe that this little bit of ink on a piece of parchment from a couple hundred years ago gave the moral right for some people to steal from other people. Wow, they must have had some powerful magic ink that by writing down on a piece of paper, we have the right to rob you, they actually altered morality. They made stealing into a good thing in certain situations. Now, I'm betting that you immediately realized when I showed you this piece of paper that it was bogus, that it was silly for me to claim that a piece of paper could give me the right to rob you. And it doesn't matter if it was done in magic marker, it doesn't matter if I printed it out, it doesn't matter if I did it myself or had other people sign it. Nothing, no ritual, no document, no legislation that I could do, that any number of people could do, could give to me the right to rob you any more than they could give me the right to murder you. But that's not what you were taught in school. You and most of your friends and most of your neighbors were all taught and all believed that this scribble on a piece of parchment gave the moral right to certain people to rob millions of other people. Will that belief, as widely held as it is more absurd by several degrees than believing that I could give myself the right to rob you with this piece of paper? For starters, at least my piece of paper claims a source for this alleged right to steal. I have the right to rob you because I said so, or because my friend said so. The Constitution doesn't even do that. It says Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. Doesn't say where they got it. Second, my scribble on a piece of paper identifies a living, breathing person to whom this right to steal is supposedly being given. Me. The Constitution claims to grant this power to people who weren't even born when the document was written, who weren't born for 200 years after the document was written. Likewise, while my scribble on a piece of paper identifies a living, breathing victim, you, the Constitution pretends to give the right to rob people who wouldn't be born until 200 years after the Constitution was written. That's like me writing, my great-great-grandchildren shall have the right to rob your great-great-grandchildren. In fact, it's worse than that, because there are no time limits in the Constitution. In short, what this scribble of ink on parchment alleges is that the people calling themselves Congress will, until the end of time, have the moral right to forcibly confiscate wealth from people without their consent. Let me put this as bluntly as I can. If you believe that this piece of paper gave me the moral right to rob you, you're out of your mind. If you believe that this piece of paper gave to Congress the moral right to rob you, you're certainly not alone, but you're still out of your mind. It's time to get back in your mind and start rethinking some of the absolute bunk that you've been taught all your life.
Essentially, I think there's something a lot of people believe, and it's especially prevalent in the Occupy Wall Street protests, and that's the belief that the government is here to help. Not necessarily a belief that the government is helping right now, but a belief that the purpose of government is to, help people advance their lives, and to help people get back on their feet, to provide a safety net, to, provide security, all that good stuff. And I think this is something that needs to be emphasized. The government is not here to help you. The government has never been here to help you. That point, I think, is especially important because a lot of people, I think, have an idea that the government used to be this wonderful thing that worked really hard towards, making sure everybody was taken care of, and somehow it's gotten derailed in some, again, it depends on who you're talking to, how recently, in the last 100 years, in the last 30 years, whatever. But that's never been the case. The government has never been here to help you. Its role is not helping people. The government exists primarily as a way for certain people to extract the labor of other people against their will. That's all it is. And that's all it ever has been. And that's all it ever will be. Because that's all it can be. Let me ask you this. If you don't accept this position that I'm putting forth. Can the government fund itself without force? No. There's a couple of immediate things that come to mind for me if you were to ask me how does the government fund itself. The first is taxation. And taxation is obviously force because you tell somebody you need to pay up, and then the only way to enforce that taxation is if you threaten them if they don't pay. So you say, well, we'll take your stuff if you don't pay, and if you don't have enough stuff, then maybe we'll put you in a cell. If you resist, we'll shoot you. It's force. Taxation is force. So obviously that's coercive. We've established that at least funding it is force, but then the majority of the things it does are force too. It's really, some of the things it does aren't force in the sense that even though they're funded by force, the act itself isn't force. Like if the government gives people food stamps, While, taking the labor of people to make those food stamps available was force, the act of giving someone a food stamp isn't force. But a lot of the things it does, like regulation, is force. Various prohibitions on personal activities such as drug use, prohibition on any sort of sexual activity, things like that. Those are force. And so if we establish government as primarily a force-oriented organization, that's what it does, I want to ask this question. If somebody genuinely wants to help you, do they have to point a gun at you and say, you will accept my help or else? No, right? Like if you're, let's say you're down on your luck and you need, a few bucks to get a meal, and I offer you a few bucks, there's no force involved there. But let's say you're doing just fine, and then I say, hey, I can provide you with free food, and you say, well, I'm not really interested. I mean, these things always have strings attached. And then I point a gun at you and say, you're going to accept this free food, and then I may call on you later to repay me. That's force. And that's essentially how government operates. It helps you by pointing a gun at you. It doesn't actually help you. That's my point, is the purpose of government is not to actually help you. It may do certain things to keep you around and to make it so that you're more loyal.
Whether they believe it or not, there's no such thing as the government, right? I mean, something exists if it's in reality. It can be seen by the senses. There is no such thing as a government. There isn't. There's a concept in our mind of a government that people believe in. That's why we have flags, anthems, buildings, and it makes people believe that because they are called a government, that what it really is there's a group of people that have guns and can enforce their force on other people and steal and rob, and it be justified because they're deemed a government. And they don't have the laws of our own lives don't apply to them anymore. So killing people no longer apply. When it's done, when they're not in a government, when someone is killed, it's murder, and it's evil, it's corrupt. When it's done by the state and the military, it's patriotic. And I know it's one of the hardest things for people to think about. And the reason is because we get into this concept that we are the government, that we're part of it. We all have this social contract, right? We waged war, we raised taxes, anything. It's we, and it's we won the war. We did not win a war. We are not part of the state. The state is everything. It's the antithesis of what we are as a society. And we accept it because it's a we. It's a community. It's okay because it's not the individual private life that we all have. Our standards change. Where we equate the government to us. That we are the state. We are the military. There's a important distinction to make. And that is that, sure, we as in the individual do make up the military and do make up the government. Individuals like us do wage war. We do kill. We do murder. We do, quote, promote democracy. The difference is that these individuals are not us. While they are individuals, they are not us. They are not a collective. They are not some abstract thing called the government. There is no such thing as the government. There are only individual people.
What do politicians really do other than talk to each other in secret? And if I won't call that a conspiracy, then I don't know what is. Government officials don't lay roads. Government officials don't heal people. Government officials don't grow food. Government officials don't teach people. Government officials administer. Paper workers. If you think about it long and hard enough, it could take 20 years. You will only come to the same conclusion. That to create such a position of power that adopts the rule of force, even, to just capture people, kidnap people, throw them in prison without a trial, without informing friends or family. When a position of power can be granted that power by you, by me, by anybody, do we really want that power? Do we really want any government?
This video is for all the people who are constantly saying, well, if not for government, we couldn't have roads, or we couldn't have police, or nobody would care for the poor, or we wouldn't be protected, whether it's from local thugs or from foreign invaders. We wouldn't have this, we wouldn't have that. So thank goodness we have government and taxes, because we wouldn't have any of those things. And the first way I'd respond to that is by pointing out the assumptions that underlie that complaint, that argument. Basically what people are saying, because let's be clear about what the terms mean, government is the people who boss everybody else around. And taxes are those people demanding money from us. So they basically tell us, hand over a whole bunch of money and we'll decide how to take care of you. We'll decide how to spend your money. If we don't like it, too bad, we don't really have a choice. Like, well, you can vote in a few years and maybe something will change, even though it totally won't. So that's what people are saying. Basically, if we didn't have a ruling class stealing our money and then supposedly spending it to protect us, how could we possibly have roads or anybody to protect us? The implication is that in this country, for example, 300 million people would just sit around thinking, oh, we can't do it. Without politicians and tax collectors, we can't have a road, we can't protect each other, and we can't... And it rests on this bizarre assumption that things that almost everybody wants, they wouldn't do anything to make happen unless there were politicians forcing us to give them money so they can make it happen. And so an example I like to use is, let's apply the same argument to food, because food is pretty darn important. I think everybody can agree. Let's apply the same argument about the roads or caring for the poor or protection or anything like that. The argument would go like this. Now, in the context of food, listen how idiotic this is. If we don't have government demanding money from all of us under the threat of caging us, and that's what taxation is, here's the money you have to give us, here's the nasty things we do to you if you don't. If that didn't happen so that they could build a big food production and distribution system and feed us, well, we'd all starve. We'd all just sit around saying, gosh, I wish we had food, but no politicians and tax collectors. We're just going to sit around and starve to death. Now, in this country, nobody would believe something that stupid, because all you have to do is go to a supermarket and see a perfect example of really efficient, organized cooperation that nobody is forced to do. There is no, if you're going to make the argument that people make about roads and protection and all that, you'd say, well, nobody is forced to make any food for anybody in this country. How do you know everyone's just going to say, well, it's not my job, and we'll all starve to death? There's no guarantee. There's no master plan guaranteeing that we'll all have food. So obviously we're all going to starve if we don't have an authoritarian government stealing our money and then making food and giving it to us. Because golly gee, we couldn't possibly do it voluntarily ourselves. Again, in this country, nobody makes that argument because they see it happening voluntarily. Nobody involved is forced to do that. Nobody is forced to make you a single bite of food. There is no guarantee at all from anybody. And yet, Americans are, by and large, hugely overweight. Obviously, we don't have a lack of food. We might have a lack of healthy food. But obviously, we see that example, oh, we can handle that. Voluntarily, mutual cooperation, that's fine for food, but for some reason, it's not okay, and we can't even fathom the idea of the exact same thing handling roads, or handling protecting us, or other things that almost everybody wants. So in the question is this bizarre assumption that everybody will sit around really, really, really wanting something, but because there aren't politicians bossing us around and stealing our money, well, how could we possibly do it? And one of the most common things is, who will build the roads? Which is amazingly stupid to me. Just amazingly stupid. I have here in my pocket a little tiny thing. With this little tiny thing, I can be most places in this country and call people all over the world. And I own it myself. I'm not anywhere near rich these days, but I own one. Almost everybody I know has one of these. A little thing that can fit in your pocket, and just on a whim, you can open it and talk to somebody who's on the other side of the planet. And there was no coercion. Nobody forced anybody to make one of these. This is the result of voluntary cooperation. And that's it. Free trade. Organization, yeah, good. Cooperation, yeah, good. Coercion, which is what government is, and taxation, which is theft, didn't need that to do this. So what these people are telling me, oh, we wouldn't have roads if we didn't have government, is that somehow free individuals interacting voluntarily can make it so I can talk to almost anybody in the world on a little thing that fits in my pocket on a budget that is not a very good budget at the moment, but I still have one of these. That freedom, not authoritarianism, can supply me with this, but freedom cannot achieve a flat place. Because that's what a road is. It's a flat place. From here to there, because we have these machines that take us from here to there. By the way, we don't have those machines because of government. We have those machines because of free enterprise and voluntary interaction and cooperation. The idea that freedom can make a car but can't make a flat place. You really think we can't make a flat place? And so I ask people, and they say, well, who will build the roads? Are you really telling me that you really and truly think that if government fell off the face of the earth, 300 million people in this country, 7 billion if we want to include the whole planet, would sit around in their houses thinking, golly, I wish I could go visit Fred, but I can't because there's not a flat thing from me to him, and I don't know how to do it. And the other 300 million or 7 billion people, we can't possibly do it because there aren't any politicians and tax collectors. If they were here, we could do it. If they were here to boss us around and steal our money and really inefficiently build a flat place, then we'd be set. Then I'd be comfortable and I could be confident that I could get places. I could visit Fred, I could go shopping, but now we're all going to sit in our houses wishing we could go to the corner store, but we can't because, golly, how could we possibly make a flat place from here to there? We can make these, where you can talk to anybody in the world. We can make machines that you drive around in, but no, we couldn't possibly make a flat place. And when people say, well, who will build the roads? The first answer is the same damn people who do it now. Politicians and tax collectors don't build the friggin' roads. Have you ever seen one out there? No, you haven't. They steal our money, waste most of it, do all their corrupt games, and then they pay other people. Here's an idea. How about if we pay those other people who actually build the stinking road? The rulers who will perpetually tell us, you can't organize anything, you can't achieve anything, you can't do anything unless we are here to force it on you. And it's, again, there are a zillion examples, whether it's caring for the poor or protection or roads, obviously, where most of the population will say, I'm really concerned that poor people won't be taken care of, which means most of the population wants people in need to be taken care of. And if we didn't have politicians stealing our money, how would it happen? Here's an idea. Take some money out of your pocket and give it to one of the people that you think needs help. Why would you not comprehend that, but you would comprehend some guy 1,000 miles away passing a law to send an armed thug to take your money, to waste 90% of it, and then give a little bit to somebody who may just be defrauding the system or may actually need it? And the amount of indoctrination required to make people even ask these questions of how could we possibly do this without government? What do you think government adds to the equation? It doesn't add any resources. It doesn't create anything. Everything it gives away, it steals from us first, by way of taxation. It doesn't add any skills. It doesn't add any knowledge. The people who are here would still be here if the institution of government fell over. We have all the know-how, we have all the resources, all the technology. The only thing it adds is one group that's imagined to have the right to violently assault and control and extort everybody else. So what the question really means is, How could we have a road? Or how could I help that poor, or how could that poor person be helped? Or how would anybody protect us if there wasn't a gang of thugs with permission to violently control and rob us? And when you recognize that that is literally what the question means, you already see how utterly idiotic it is. And it's completely the result of authoritarian statist indoctrination. Nobody would come up with that on their own. And you obviously don't see that with the example of food or cars or cell phones or anything else. Nobody says, we won't be able to talk to each other unless there's a gang of thugs that's allowed to boss us around and steal our money. And just economically, how stupid you have to be to think that's a good idea. Here are your choices. Let's do this. I'll give you these two choices for how you will be fed from now on. Either you can go spend your own money wherever you want. You can go to the supermarket or the local this or the local grocery, whatever you want. You can go decide what you want, and they'll tell you the price. You decide what you're going to buy and how much. And you can go to different places and you can shop around and you can do all that. That's option number one. But let me warn you, option number one does not give any guarantee that you will be fed. There's no master plan forcing people to feed you. So, oh my gosh, you better be really scared of that option, despite the fact that you can do it day after day and it works really darn well and feeds pretty much not only this country, but with a massive surplus. Option number two is politicians will take as much money of yours as they decide to take. Then they will decide what, if anything, they will buy with that money in terms of food to give to you, to feed you. Do you really think that will serve you better, that will feed you better? Yeah, I'm much more comfortable that I'll have I'll be fed, I'll be secure, everything will be okay. If a gang of thugs who doesn't really care about me steals my money and then decides what, if anything, to give me back from what they stole. But that is implied in the question, whatever you put in the blank. How are we going to have blank if not for government? What you're saying is, how can we, the people who really want roads and food and cell phones and protection and all the things that almost everybody wants, how can we possibly have that unless we give someone permission to steal our money and boss us around and then decide what they're going to give us? And the same thing applies no matter what you put in the blank. How will we possibly do blank without government? One of the silly ones is caring for the poor. How will we care for the poor? Think of what that means. But what takes the cake, the ultimately insane thing, whatever you put in that gap, how can we have blank without a parasitic ruling class and a bunch of hired thieves? It's just a stupid question, but it's extra super stupid when what's in the blank is, how will we be protected? Who will protect us from thieves and robbers if we don't have government? It's the most idiotic question. It's also the most frequent question. So here's what the question literally means. If we don't give a certain gang of people permission to violently control us and take our money under threat of putting us in a cage, who will protect us from people who might commit aggression against us and take our money? Wanting government for that is exactly as brilliant as saying, we have to have a carjacker in our town, otherwise somebody might steal our cars. But again, the ultimate thing is protection. When people say, who will protect us from aggressors and thugs and thieves if we don't have a government? Even though what government is, by its very nature, is a gang of aggressors and thugs and thieves. They issue commands. Every law they pass is a command backed by a threat of violence. You have to do this, you're not allowed to do that. Here are the nasty things we will do to you if you get caught disobeying. I mean, everybody knows that, even though they don't usually say it in terms that blunt and honest and accurate. But to say we need taxes to be protected is as stupid as you can get. It's saying we need theft to avoid theft. And the fact that people are trained to use different words so that this theft sounds okay. It's legalized, it's taxation, and we voted for the people who robbed us. Like, we got to elect our local carjacker, and that means he represents us when he demands our car and points a gun in our face. He's serving us as he steals our car because he's going to use that car and sell it and make money to make sure nobody else steals our car. That is the essence of government. And the fact that you have hundreds of millions of victims of that scam vehemently defending it and saying, I'm not going to give that up. I don't want to give up government. Who would protect us? I don't want to give up the biggest aggressor on the planet, the biggest thief on the planet. Look at your tax bill and see how much private crooks steal from you. So before you ask that question, before you ask, how could we possibly have roads or protection or water or air or Christmas or Santa Claus, or think about what the question actually means.
Many people, when they hear the word anarchy, think of chaos and mayhem. So they assume that an anarchist must be in favor of disorder and violence. That is the complete opposite of the truth. Most objections and complaints about the anarchist or voluntarist philosophy are not actually about the philosophy itself, but result from people misunderstanding what the philosophy is all about. To illustrate a few points, we will use the example of two fictional islands. Authoritania, where there is a ruling class or government, and anarchia, where there is no ruling class of any kind. We will use these islands to examine several common misconceptions about anarchism. Lots of people think anarchy means every man for himself, or survival of the fittest, or the absence of any social cooperation or organization. They think that anarchy means everyone has to be self-sufficient. This comes from the false assumption that some kind of government is necessary for any organization to occur. Whether it's part of a republic, a democracy, a kingdom, or a dictatorship, a ruling class issues orders called laws and punishes anyone who disobeys them. That is not cooperation. That's domination. It's one group forcing its will on another. Authoritarianism can be used to force people into organized patterns, but that does not mean that people are incapable of organizing their activities without being forced. The most productive and useful examples of organization that we see today are anarchistic in nature. No one was forced to build the grocery store you go to. No one was forced to produce or sell anything in it. Everyone involved in the vastly complex operation of growing your food, transporting it, displaying it in the store, and selling it to you, everyone involved participates voluntarily, working in exchange for money. You and all the other store customers choose freely which store to go to and what to spend your money on. This purely voluntary arrangement allows for an amazingly complex degree of organized cooperation without anyone being coerced to participate. In contrast, under government, a very small group of people comes up with an idea and forces everyone else to participate in it and provide for its funding with tax dollars. In the authoritarian version of a supermarket, the ruling class would tell people what to produce and how much, what prices to charge, and they would tell customers what they must buy and what they must pay. Anyone who did not comply with the centralized master plan would be punished in some way. That is how government does things. Which one of these would you prefer? Another common but incorrect assumption is that if there were no ruling class or no government, people would have no way of defending themselves against common criminals or foreign invaders. Again, this is simply not true. The government version of protection is inherently hypocritical. Governments will use their hired law enforcers to find and lock up some of the private thugs and thieves and prevent them from preying on people. But every ruling class gets the money for its operations by way of taxation, demanding money from its subjects and punishing those who don't pay up. Oddly, every ruling class insists that it needs to be able to forcibly control and extort money from people in this way in order to protect them from private criminals who might try to forcibly control and extort them. In contrast, if there is no government, people do not lose their inherent right to defend themselves from violence or to defend what they have from those who would take it. Every person has this right, And they also have the right to organize and cooperate with each other to exercise that right. Organizing for mutual defense does not require any government-granted laws or authority. No one wants to be attacked or defrauded, and everyone wants to feel safe. Whether each person takes this on himself or herself individually, or whether they hire and organize others to do it on their behalf, it can be done on a voluntary basis. Those who insist that government is necessary often claim that if there wasn't a government, then smaller private gangs would spring up to enslave and rob people. Organized crime gangs exist along with government, and most people do not understand the dynamics between them and how government enriches and empowers organized crime while appearing to fight it. Black markets enrich organized crime, and money allows them to buy government protection. There's no reason to think they would do as well in an environment of freedom, where they would have fewer ways to make money and would be up against both individual and organized armed citizens. A criminal gang that's recognized as such has far less power than a gang whose aggression is perceived to be legitimate and proper. And that's the gang we call government. When thuggery is called law enforcement, and thievery is called taxation, and self-defense is called crime and terrorism, then even the widespread ownership of firearms can't do much to stop the aggression. Imagine a private gang trying to do the things that government does without the aura of authority, and imagine how a well-armed population would respond to this. The gang would fail quickly and dramatically. Another concern that people have when they first consider the idea of a stateless society is that some people are truly malicious, destructive, and sociopathic. The concern is that these people would be free to do anything they wanted and no one would stop them. But this concern is again based on a basic misunderstanding of human nature. Wherever we have a government ruling class, we still have freelance thieves and thugs who are not deterred by the laws of the politicians. In some instances, they're stopped by force by the police, or they decide not to commit a crime for fear of what the police might do to them. What makes this deterrence work is not the legislation or the official badges, but the simple threat of harm to the sociopath. It really makes no difference whether the threat comes from the police, or another citizen, or even another criminal. A sociopath doesn't care about laws or social rules. He cares about avoiding pain and hardship for himself. This is still true when a government ruling class is not involved at all. If the intended target of a would-be carjacker pulls out a gun, it doesn't make any difference to the carjacker whether that person has a badge or whether there's a law against taking people's cars. Discouraging nasty people from hurting others does not require special authority, only the ability to use defensive force. Ironically, though people hope that government will protect them, having a government, a gang which is believed to have the right to tax and control people, just creates one gang so big and powerful that normal people can't resist it. In short, to create a huge gang and then give it societal permission to control and extort people with the hope that this gang will prevent theft and thuggery is simply a self-contradictory idea, but that's what government always is. Some people might assume that if people organize for mutual protection and defense, then that's what government is. But there's an essential difference. People coming together to do something that everyone has the right to do, such as defend yourself, doesn't require any special authority. It's not government unless one group of people claims the right to do things which others do not have the right to do, such as taxing and controlling innocent people. Organized defense can be very effective without supposing the special right to rule over others, in other words, without being government. In contrast, Governments rob the people they rule of far more wealth than private crooks could ever manage, making the idea of a protector government ridiculous. Another common objection to the idea of a stateless society is the notion that, if not for a group of lawmakers telling the rest of us how to behave, we would all behave like stupid, irresponsible, violent animals. This claim implies one of two things. Either we normal people have no idea what is right and wrong unless and until politicians tell us, or the only reason we want to do the right thing and coexist peacefully is because politicians told us to. A quick examination of your own motivations will show you that neither of those things is actually true. It's particularly odd to make this argument in a society where politicians are voted into power. If the people themselves have no moral code and no conscience, and are just stupid, violent animals, why does almost everyone want government to keep the peace and protect the innocent? Would a population of vicious, heartless, evil people try to elect good people to keep the evil people in line? Obviously not. The goodness and the desire for order and peace comes from us, not from the lawmakers we vote into office. The same holds true of everything that government does. If people are so short-sighted and selfish that they can't be trusted to voluntarily organize and raise money for whatever they deem important, then how can those same people be trusted to decide who should be in power? The implication is that the average person can't be trusted to run his own life, but can be trusted to choose someone to run other people's lives. Government is really not a civilizing influence. It's actually an uncivilizing influence. People who would never personally rob their neighbors constantly use the government to do it for them by way of taxation. People who would never dream of trying to control minute details of their neighbors' lives think it's just fine to vote for politicians to do it instead. Government gives everyone the opportunity and encouragement to rob and control other people without risk. So government, rather than serving as a check against the imperfections of our nature, instead drastically amplifies our greed, irresponsibility, and malice towards other human beings by giving us a legally acceptable and risk-free way to interfere with the lives and choices of our fellow men and women. Government brings out the criminal and busybody in everyone. In contrast, in the absence of a ruling class, people would lose their ability to ask lawmakers to interfere with their neighbors' lives. And we would not have law enforcers who could avoid responsibility for evil deeds by claiming that they were just following orders. Throughout history, far more theft, assault, oppression, and even murder has been committed by those acting on behalf of a supposed authority than by anybody else. Even basically good people, when they believe in government, will condone things or do things which they know would be wrong if they did them on their own. Most people know that theft and assault are bad, but they imagine that controlling their neighbors and forcing them to spend their money on things they don't want is perfectly moral and legitimate when it's done by way of the political process. Wrong becomes right when it's called taxation, legislation, regulation, and war. Anarchists know better. They know that human society will never be perfect, but it would be a whole lot better if evil deeds were committed only by genuinely nasty, sociopathic people, rather than being committed wholesale by basically good people who think that violent aggression is okay when it's called law enforcement. Most people already know how to get along with others, and most people want a peaceful and just society. Our morality doesn't come from politicians making laws. Our ability to organize and cooperate doesn't come from the ruling class. When people escape the belief in government, they don't suddenly turn into violent animals. Our inherent right to defend ourselves and our ability to defend ourselves is not served by government. In fact, it's threatened by government more than by anything else. Ruling classes do not produce peaceful coexistence, but rather perpetual conflict and violence. Our belief in government authority takes our compassion, virtue, and good intentions and turns them into power for people who crave power and riches. Of course, the people who benefit most from the political racket will put a good spin on the system and do their best to convince people that it's a social necessity. But ask yourself this: have the thousands of laws, regulations, and taxes imposed on you by politicians made you a better person? Have they made you more productive or more caring? Is the world better off with the politicians taking your money and telling you how to live your life? Or do you think it might have been better off if you'd been allowed to spend your own money and make your own decisions? Is society really best served by a small class of people forcefully imposing a centralized master plan on everyone else? Can the orders and threats of a ruling class make the world what it should be? Or would society be better served by human freedom and respect for individual rights, by voluntary cooperation and peaceful organization? If this second option sounds better to you, maybe you should learn more about anarchism. Some people dismiss anarchism as a utopian idea that would only work if everyone were generous and compassionate. Obviously, everyone is not generous and compassionate all the time. But these people need to look at the other side of the coin. If people are too stupid, greedy, and malicious to be free, aren't they too stupid, greedy, and malicious to be trusted with power over others? Whether people are inherently good, bad, or some of each, giving a person power over others is not going to make that person better. In fact, power has historically been known to corrupt people and make them worse, whereas the discipline imposed by the equal freedom of everyone else brings out the best in human nature. Most people today think that we need some form of government because they mistakenly believe that obedience to authority makes us all more civilized, moral, and peaceful. In reality, it has always done exactly the opposite. Everyone knows that governments can be corrupt, abusive, inefficient, counterproductive, even tyrannical. But most people assume that the way to fix that is to get the right people into power. People have spent centuries trying to create a good society using different kinds of ruling classes, different legal structures, different ways of choosing the rulers, and so on. But every governmental construction has resulted in freedom and riches for some, and oppression, violence, and poverty for others. What if instead of looking to a ruling class to impose our values on society, we embrace the concept of self-ownership? These principles are simple and easy, to the point of being self-evident, but they're diametrically opposed to the authoritarian principles that most of us have been indoctrinated with. Anarchism does not mean chaos and violence, or every man for himself. Having no government does not mean having no morality, no organization, and no cooperation. Simply put, anarchism does mean that no one is your master and no one is your slave. And that's all it means.
Law without Government. Part 1. Principles. What is government? Government is defined as a territorial monopolist in the field of producing law. It is the sole provider of law, the ultimate decision-maker, arbitrator, and wielder of force within a territory. As a monopoly, it maintains its position by using aggression, the use or threat of violence, to prevent competing providers of law from emerging. Government is the only organisation that uses the political means. that is, the widely accepted use of aggression to attain wealth. For example, the monopolist declares its own acts of theft to be legal, calling it taxation and enforcing compliance. Everyone else must attain wealth using the economic means, producing something of value to others and then engaging in voluntary acts of trade. Government is a territorial monopolist of law. But what is law? Interpersonal conflicts are possible due to material scarcity of resources and goods, and diversity of interests between individuals. The potential for conflicts makes property rules and ownership rights necessary for social cooperation. For example, apples are scarce, and this means that if two people both want to eat a particular apple, they cannot both be satisfied. For conflict avoidance, we need property rules to establish who has the ownership right over the apple, that is, who has the right to decide how the apple is used. Laws are property rules that emerge from the resolution of conflicts. The production of law, the resolving of conflicts, is a service provided by an arbitrator or judge. Imagine two individuals stranded on a desert island, Adam and Ben. Adam picks a supply of apples, but then Ben comes along and takes an apple without Adam's consent. That's my apple, because I picked it. It's my apple, because it was on my tree. With no one else on the island, Adam and Ben have no one they can turn to for help resolving this conflict. They may succeed in negotiating a peaceful settlement, or they may resort to physical violence. Now suppose there is a third individual on the island, Charlie. Now there is another possible way for Adam and Ben to resolve their apple conflict peacefully. Ask Charlie for his opinion and agree to whatever resolution he suggests. We're having a dispute over an apple. Both of us claim it as our own. Will you arbitrate for us? This is third-party dispute resolution. Adam and Ben both make their cases to Charlie. Charlie must decide who he believes has the stronger claim to the disputed apple, and then pronounce a judgment on the case. I do not think Ben owned the tree, so I award ownership of the apple to Adam. Charlie has just produced a law. He has made a judgment about who the rightful owner of a disputed property is. He has awarded legal ownership of a property to one of the disputants. But Adam feels that it would be unjust if Ben only has to return the apple he stole. Adam wants Ben to be punished and wants compensation for having his time wasted. He insists that Ben pay him 5 additional apples, and then he will consider the matter settled. Unable to resolve this dispute between themselves, they ask Charlie for his opinion. Charlie recognizes the need to compensate Adam for his lost time, and to punish Ben. His opinion is that a payment of 2 additional apples from Ben to Adam would be a just resolution to this conflict. Since the purpose of Adam and Ben turning to Charlie was to help them resolve the dispute peacefully, both men will agree to his decision. If one of them does not, then they are back to having to resolve the conflict between themselves, either peacefully or otherwise. By arbitrating on a conflict and helping to resolve it peacefully, Charlie has produced a law. Now suppose sometime later on the island another conflict occurs, this time between Adam and Charlie. If they cannot resolve the dispute between themselves, they could ask Ben to arbitrate for them. I'll arbitrate for you. When Ben provides them with his opinion on the conflict and suggests a resolution, he too will have produced a law. And if Ben and Charlie ever get into a dispute, they could ask Adam to produce a law for them. There are multiple producers of law in this society. No single producer of law is in a privileged position. There is no ruler and no one is ruled. Everyone is of equal status with respect to the laws. What would a monopoly of the production of law look like on our island? I'll arbitrate for you. No, you are not allowed to arbitrate. I am the only one who can produce law on this island. My law is the law. The injustice of this arrangement would be immediately apparent to both Adam and Ben. But that would mean that you even get to be judge in disputes you are involved in. And you could do whatever you want, like steal from us and order us around, and call it legal. That's right. I am the state. Charlie could only establish himself as ruler and maintain that position if he could somehow convince Adam and Ben that a ruler is necessary, and that with no ruler, anarchy, there would be chaos and disorder. If Charlie is able to maintain a monopoly of arbitration and ultimate decision-making, he will have put himself above the law, and Adam and Ben can no longer be considered free men. Now suppose there are a few more individuals in this island society, and two of them have a dispute that they cannot resolve peacefully among themselves. The disputants have a choice of arbitrators that might help them resolve the conflict. There is competition in the production of law. Who will they choose? The ideal arbitrator will be someone who is impartial and who has a good reputation for being fair, honest, and wise. With a larger population, some individuals who possess these qualities may find that they can make a living purely by providing arbitration services to disputants. They will be professional judges and may create firms selling laws. Their consumers will be disputants who need help resolving a conflict, and their income will depend on their reputation for making wise and fair decisions. If any one of them tries to become a monopolist, for example by insisting on being judge in a case involving himself or a member of his family, he will quickly lose his reputation and his livelihood. The principles of having competition in the field of law do not change as society becomes larger and more complex.
How would anarchic courts work? Well, let's say two people have a dispute. They can't resolve it, so they both agree on an arbiter to settle the dispute. The arbiter, who they both agree on, will issue a ruling. Now, there is no force behind the ruling, no guns, and so let's say the court rules against person A. Person A now has two choices: ignore or accept the ruling. Choices have consequences. If he ignores the ruling, then he will pay a price in terms of reputation. A credit report company, or in the absence of a state, a crime report company will lower their rating of this person. Someone who ignores court rulings, we can expect, will have a very low credit or crime rating, as well as a personal reputation, which is true for the current system. You know, O.J. Simpson got off on the court ruling after killing a woman, but he paid the price in his reputation, and looks like he could be going to prison again pretty soon, or already is, or something like that. I don't know. I'm not keeping up. Also, keep in mind that eBay enforces compliance through seller ratings, which is analogous to a credit rating. There's no force behind these seller ratings. It's just people know it's negative enforcement. These kinds of things already exist. These things are already private. Anarchism would only increase the degree. It's nothing new in kind. Nothing new would be created in an anarchic court system, just an expansion of what already is and what already works. If you still think public courts are absolutely necessary, keep in mind that 14% of Americans in the free market disagree. Now, 30% of the U.S. economy is government and 10% of the economy is underground, depending on who you ask. So that means 14% of the free U.S. economy is underground. 14% of the non-government U.S. economy is underground. Now, when you go underground, you have obviously given up access to police protection and the law courts. You have also given up access to private measures of risk assessment, credit ratings, and seller ratings. Why? Because if you started to provide credit reports for underground economic activity, the cops would be all over you instantly. You have also given up access to private courts for the same reasons, and you are also taking a risk of being thrown in jail for your activity. All despite that, 14% of Americans in the free economy choose to go underground than to pay taxes. That is how worthless police protection and the law courts are. Americans, a lot of Americans, aren't just giving up public protection, but they are taking a risk. And it makes sense, because the court system isn't functional anymore, and you don't even need to flesh out why. I mean, there's plenty of people who do know, who can give you line and verse about how crappy our legal system is, but you don't need to flesh out why. The fact that 14% take a risk just to avoid it is all the necessary proof. And on a more fundamental level, if you think about how there are so many people and so few guns. If there are so many people and so few guns, then there's no way that the state can be an effective enforcement of contracts and can be an effective arbiter of problems. So that means that the majority of problems need to be worked out amongst people, because the state just doesn't have enough manpower to deal with all the problems of the world. All right, so just from that alone, we know that the state is not going to be an effective or even particularly important arbiter. And the failure of the public courts has to do with the public courts system being a monopoly, but I hardly think that's necessary. The failure of the public court system is so spectacular that it's common knowledge, and nobody credibly defends the public court system as being efficient anymore. All anyone does today is say that, well, things would be even worse without it. Government is a necessary evil. I'd be very interested to see anyone who claims that private courts either don't exist or are ineffectual. The last line of defense for public courts, and let's be honest, that's what it is, it's a defense. Okay, when people defend public courts, it's not an honest intellectual enterprise, it's a socialized defense. I know this because it's what I was doing. The last line of defense for public courts is the poor. See, in our wonderful system, the poor can't afford to defend themselves from legal predators, so they get help from the public pretenders. In a private system, you could actually have courts that appoint lawyers to both sides, and if you are poor and you get sued, you can insist on a court that does so. Okay? Now, let's say a rich man sues a poor man, and the poor man refuses the trial because he can't afford representation. The poor man can then insist on a parity court, we'll call it. The court that the rich man chose can then review the financial situation of the poor man, and in all likelihood agree that the case should be settled in a parity court. And if the court itself gets bribed, and if the rich man's courts itself gets bribed into ruling in favor of the rich man by default that the poor man didn't show up, then that court is going to lose credibility, and the credit report companies will no longer accept rulings from that rich man, from the rich man court which got bribed. Okay, that's just one way integrity could be maintained. And you know what? It's something I just made up on the fly. Okay, imagine what someone who really thought this through could come up with. Okay, but it all comes down to the fact that people solve problems all the time, and a state is here's the big thing that all anarchists that is the fundamental thing that anarchists that made me an anarchist. A state is just people. What's more is that the people in the state are not incentivized to solve problems. They are incentivized to grow their departments. And whether they actually solve problems is immaterial. It's immaterial. Why? Because there's no competition. If a court issues a ruling, there's no legal recourse anyone can take except other public courts. So think about it. So here's how sick this is. If a lower court issues a ruling, or has a reputation of issuing rulings, what are people going to do? They're going to appeal a lot. They're going to create more jobs for the courts. They're going to create more business for the public courts. Okay, that's how the public court system. That's what happens when you have a monopoly on the court system. I don't know how many laws there are, but there are so many laws on the books that if someone wants you, they can sue you. Okay, anyone who hates you enough can just inspect and inspect and inspect until they find some arcane law that you broke. but of course, ignorance of the law is no excuse. When you have so many laws on the books that are structured in a way that you can basically be sued on a whim, that is operationally no different from there being no law. But it's worse than that because the state has a monopoly on the courts. They can issue rulings and are accountable to no one. And in that sense, the current situation is worse than anarchy. Much worse.
Morning, everyone. Today I just want to talk a little bit about money, and sort of like this is a resource that many of us who are preparing, trying to like deal with hard economic conditions, who are trying to provide for our families, that's something that we need to deal with on a daily basis. And before anybody can go out there and say I can survive anything, we really need to look at just the things that are keeping us from actually surviving and thriving in this world. So to begin with, I just want to talk a little bit about what exactly is money, and then we can talk about how money is actually used as a tool to really enslave people in this country. So first, money, the textbook definition for it is a fungible value or means of exchange between people for goods and services, right? So it's basically a kind of mental abstraction that we use to basically allow for commerce, for trading of surpluses that we can produce with the surpluses of other people. Back in the days, in ancient times, people used precious metals for money. Things like gold and silver and that kind of deal. And that worked for a while, right? Before they used gold and silver, they used things like food, like grains. They used things like salt, shells, beads of various sorts. Native Americans in these parts, they actually used this thing called a cowrie, which is really like a large oyster shell to trade and exchange and commerce. So money has been with humanity for a very long time, thousands of years, in fact. But I do believe that most Americans don't really realize what exactly money is. Money isn't a piece of metal. It's not a piece of paper. It's not even a natural resource like oil or gas or whatever. If we really think about it, money is the life energy, the productive energy of human beings, right? Ultimately, all the oil in the ground doesn't mean anything unless you can get some people, engineers, technicians, people to go there, mine it, and extract that energy, right? You have forests filled with like hardwoods, but you need people to actually go and cut it down, process it, machine it, turn it into furniture or whatever consumable goods we have. Conversely, even the most automated factories that you can imagine those giant like robotic factories in Japan where people crank out like millions of cars with just 10 people. Nevertheless, think of all the engineers, scientists, and mechanics behind the scenes necessary to make this factory function. Think of the people running the power plants. So ultimately, money is the productive time from human beings. Now with that said, some people's time are more productive than others, right? Depending on your level of training or education or just skills or innate abilities, some people may be far more productive than other people, right? And that's fine. But ultimately, every person basically has this conversion rate. X number of dollars or pounds or yens or whatever for every hour of your productive time. Okay, so now with that out of the way, right, let's talk about sort of like the symbols that we use for money, right? Keep this in mind, that money equals your life, units of your life that you're giving up for it. Now, any kind of currency, whether it's paper or digital bits in a computer or silver, gold, things like that, anything like that can be debased. Any currency that we use can be debased. If people believe that by hoarding gold and silver they can create a store of value, I believe that it's actually a false truth, right? Because fundamentally, even precious metals can be debased. You know, during ancient times, successive rulers of various kingdoms and dynasties in the Roman Empire, everybody did debasement, and they did it through two ways, right? One is to increase the amount of non-precious metal content within coins that are supposedly of precious metals. They've been doing that for a long time. You know, during the era of the Roman Republic, coins were almost entirely made from silver, and it's been debased such that at the fall of the empire, there was almost nothing. There was like 1 or 2% silver content in a Roman sesterce, right? Same thing can be done another way. The other way to debase precious metals is to vastly increase the supply of it. You know, there are kind of like government campaigns, say during the Spanish Empire, to enslave the New World, mine out all the gold and silver, drastically increasing the amount of precious metals. You know, there was a period of time in the 1500s where effectively there was so much gold running around in Spain and France at the time that a loaf of bread was the equivalent of like a quarter of an ounce of gold to buy a loaf of bread. So trusting precious metals as sort of like a currency, it's not 100% foolproof plan, right? So now, if we really think about this, if money truly equals time, the productive life energy of human beings, right, then ultimately, what is money, right? Money is us. Money is our productive existence. The fact that a person can be made to go and work, perhaps he loves it, perhaps it's against his will, but to do productive work, that is money.
Okay, let me see if I have a piece of paper around here. Paper money. Paper has no intrinsic value. It's just, you know, like here's a piece of cardboard. This is worth the same amount as paper, but just think about how little communication it takes to use paper for economic transactions. When you go into a restaurant or you go into the grocery store or anywhere, you just hand them this piece of paper or this piece of plastic, a debit card or a credit card. You don't have to say anything, you just nod your head, you point, and then, you know, everything's taken care of. It's monopolized. The government says that only U.S. dollars are money, even though the Constitution says that gold and silver is money. But even gold and silver, that's still a limited form of currency. I'm not anti-currency. I'm pro everything being a currency. I think that if you walk into a grocery store, you should be able to trade anything for anything as long as both parties agree to it. But the government has made it where paper money, U.S. dollars, are the only things that can be accepted for economic trade. Now, bartering does still happen in America. Bartering will always be around, you know, trade this for trade that. But just the fact that through taxation, the U.S. dollar has, well, not just U.S. dollar, but paper money all around the world, and because of government enforcement of that money, it becomes so important that you can't live without it, that it becomes a better mode of economic transactions than using bartering, because most people pay their rent with paper money. Most people do everything in paper money. Very few landlords would be willing to take bartering services in exchange for rent, because that landlord has to pay taxes. It's as simple as that. But what if we lived in a world where bartering was encouraged and it was just totally the norm? And just think about how much communication bartering takes. I think that paper money has made us a much more colder society, because whenever you have an item that you want to trade for another item, it takes communication. If I have this baton right here, this is a self-defense weapon, and I wanted to trade it for this cell phone, well, I would have to discuss it with this person, like, hey, I want that cell phone, I have this baton, would you like to trade? And maybe the person wants it, maybe they don't. If they don't want it, then I'll try to figure out what they may want, and then I'll go try to acquire that. And if I cannot acquire, I'll find somebody else who has that cell phone or similar cell phone, and then just go from there.
It should be just free market interactions of people, and money itself should never be controlled by the government. You never want the government to do anything in the first place, and least of all is money the most important thing in life in terms of an economy. If people get confused, though, they think bankers are bad. A real true free market banker isn't bad at all. He's just a person who holds your money, usually it's gold or silver, whatever it is, and when you want it, he gives it back to you. That's really all banking is, but it's been all twisted now, and now they're all part of the government, and they can create as much money as they want, and there's fractional reserve banking, which is all legalized, and it's created where we are today. And
going back to 1900 or 1913, your dollar, that $1 bill, is now only worth about 3.5 cents because of the inflation that's gone through it. But this is only possible because of legal tender laws. So basically what the government did, and obviously you know this, Jeff, it's for other people out there, legal tender laws basically said, here's this dollar bill that the government made. You have to accept this if you're in our region, right? So it basically oligopolizes the thing. And then, on top of it, they stop people, like there's people who want to make gold coins and competing currencies out there. Against the law, you're not free to do that. You will go into a jail for doing that peaceful activity.
Everyone, Mike Shanklin from the Peace, Freedom, Prosperity Movement and VoluntaryVirtues.com. Glad you guys could join us once again. I know I'm doing a lot of these video casts lately, but tonight I wanted to have Rothschild back on one more time so we could talk about not having to work for anybody else in a free society, in capitalism, in voluntarism, in this horrible, insane world called letting peaceful people do what they want. Anyway, how you doing, Rothschild?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing great, man. So let's get right into it. I hear a lot of people complain about, or they state at least, that they believe that you would have to work for somebody else in a capitalist society, in a free society where property rights are basically adhered to. And I like to counter this by often saying, actually, there's numerous people, even in statism today, who are self-sustainable on their own land, even in cities, right? They grow their own food, they have solar panel housing, they do everything without having to go to to the government or to the system for their benevolence and altruism. So I think it's really important for us to realize that people even today, when it's even harder to be self-sustainable, when most people aren't even thinking in that mind frame, you can be self-sustainable. There's an alternative to having to work for anybody else, right? So you can be self-sustainable and not have to work for anybody else. You can grow your own garden, which I would encourage most people to do. I'm starting that up myself, and it seems to be a good venture, and I think you'll save money. I think you'll be healthier. Just if you could have that option and you have that time, it's something you might want to think about. But I'd like to point out the fact, and I think you would agree with me, you don't have to work for anybody, right? It's in statism. It's in statism where you have to work through May just to start paying yourself after paying taxes.
I've never really heard that particular form of argument.
Well, that's where the wage slavery argument comes from, too, is that, oh, don't you get it, you're a slave because you have to go into the wage labor area and be a laborer. No, you don't have to be a laborer for anybody else. You don't have to go work in the steel mines or in the coal factories or anywhere else. Be self-sustainable in your own house. You can go fishing, you can go hunting, you can do lots of different things. Raise your own cattle on your own house.
So I think, you don't have to work for anyone else.
Yeah, and you can even become a part of the commune too. That's always an option in capitalism. You can still have communes. People can pool their capital together and create a ranch and call it a commune and do whatever you want there, right? And feed all the poor people. I encourage that all day long. That's part of freedom.
This is the world we live in. If we weren't surrounded by it every day, if we didn't take it for granted, we'd be dumbstruck by its very intricacy and brilliance. This is an ordinary, familiar wooden pencil. You might think a pencil is simple. Chances are you've been using one since before you could even read or write. But just because it's familiar doesn't mean it's simple. In fact, it's complicated, elaborate, beautiful, elegant. Its very existence is too improbable for any one person to truly comprehend. These are the basic materials that go into a pencil: graphite, cedar, metal, and rubber. But if you had all the elements of a pencil right in front of you. Could you make a pencil? It's not as easy as you might think. In fact, no single person on the face of the earth could do it without the help of countless others. And this is the key to understanding the world. A pencil, just like you and me, is the end result of a vast and intricate family tree, a symphony of human activity that spans the globe. Through their work and knowledge, a vast number of people have had a hand in making this simple pencil. Unlike your family tree, this one begins with an actual tree. The most immediate ancestor of the pencil is a cedar tree in the Pacific Northwest. But the loggers who harvest the timber are also its ancestors. And these men don't work alone. They in turn are assisted by the people and industries that produce the saws, rope, and countless other tools that they use. These are also the ancestors of our pencil. As is the waitress at a nearby diner who sells the loggers lunch, to say nothing of the thousands of people involved in producing that simple midday meal. Across time and space, the web grows. Consider the roads, trucks, ships, communication systems, and the people who design, build, and maintain them. All of them are necessary to bring the lumber to the mills and the slat factories that process them. All of them are also the ancestors of the pencil. And even with the work of all these people, so far all we have is a stained wooden slat, a naked half of a wooden body of a pencil. But its family tree is larger and more extensive. The graphite is mined in China and Sri Lanka. At the pencil factory, it's mixed with clay and heat and other materials before it's extruded, dried, and baked in a kiln. People from different continents, different cultures, cooperate to bring these materials together with waxes and kilns and equipment from across the world. These too are the ancestors of the pencil. And the same is true of the eraser. With ingredients from around the world, it's the end result of a similarly complex and exotic branch of the family tree. As is the ferrule, the metal band made from material that is mined, refined, and shipped from all over the world. Each part of the pencil is the result of the collaboration and cooperation of millions of people. Together, they form a process that is constantly changing and adapting. A change in the availability or cost of material from one place might make another source more desirable, and the process changes and adapts fluidly. And there is a fact that's still more astounding: the absence of a mastermind, of anyone dictating these countless actions which bring a pencil into being. Each member of this family tree supplies only a small amount of the necessary know-how needed to make a pencil. They do so voluntarily, not because they necessarily want pencils or like pencils, but because by working to create them, they exchange their labor and skills for the wages that let them buy what they want and need. What you're seeing is the market at work. The spontaneous configuration of creative human energies, of millions of people with their various skills and talents organizing voluntarily in response to human necessity and desire, as if led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of the intention. Every second we are alive, we benefit from the products of voluntary, spontaneous cooperation. This is the modern world. It's miraculous, it's intricate, and it gets better every day, so long as people are free to interact with each other. If we can leave the creative energies of humankind uninhibited, there's no limit to what we can accomplish.
Imagine you have a friend called George. You've been friends since childhood. Although you're not as close as you were back then, you still see each other once in a while and get along very well. One day, you and George are approached by an old mutual friend, Oliver. Oliver explains that he's had a run of bad luck and is raising money to cover tuition fees for his kids. You want to help Oliver out, so you give him some money. To your surprise, George doesn't offer Oliver any help. You try to persuade him, but it's no use. Imagining yourself in this situation, do you think it's okay to threaten to use physical force against George to get him to do the right thing? Now imagine a slightly different situation. This time, a group of your friends take a vote. 6 out of 10 are in favour of threatening George to get him to help Oliver. Does this democratic process make it okay to threaten George? One last change to the situation. This time, imagine that many thousands of people have democratically agreed that a group, who we'll call the agents, should do whatever is necessary to take money from George and give it to Oliver's family. The agents don't explicitly threaten George at first. All they do is send him a bill. Like everyone else, though, George knows what will happen if he doesn't pay the bill. First, he'll get more letters demanding payment, and the bill will get bigger. Eventually, if he still doesn't pay, agents with guns will break into his house and take him away against his will. Almost everyone pays the bills without protest. They know that agents are prepared to use as much force as necessary to overpower you if you resist. Do you think it's acceptable for the agents to threaten violence against George if he doesn't give his money towards helping Oliver's family? If we approve of state programs that redistribute wealth, we must also approve of threats of violence made against peaceful individuals, because this is how the funds are collected. On the other hand, most of us feel uncomfortable about threatening peaceful people when we imagine having to make the threats ourselves. If we feel negatively towards the idea of threatening George personally, can we really be comfortable with the threats made against him by agents of the state? Some people believe that voluntary interaction and spontaneous order are realistic and preferable alternatives to state coercion as a way of organising society. Do a web search for some of these terms if you're interested in learning more.